Fulda. There is after me Cécille Robert. Where is she? From Sciences Po Lyon. And then there is Virginie van Ingeldom from UCL Louvain. And we have conceptual and empirical thoughts around the relation of citizens' democracy and the EU, politicization, focus groups. So you will see. So I'm starting with some reflections on how to conceptualize politicization. So the concept of politicization is one that has been becoming very important in empirical research and especially in European integration studies. So there has been a lot of talk about whether a politicization of European integration is something that is beneficial for European integration, or whether a politicization of European integration just leads to more protests against the European Union. It's especially the rise of votes for right-wing populist parties that is often associated with the politicization of European integration. And there is a huge bulk of often very interesting empirical studies. Most of them are quantitative, and most of these studies focus on what is called the salience of political issues. So how often are issues like, for instance, migration or COVID discussed in the quality press? So to me, I have I think another theoretical and methodological background. When I started to think about politicization, I was puzzled by these definitions, and I started to think about politicization as a concept. So this presents, and I think I never did it also to the partners of our project, this presents sort of a summary of most of my sort of thinking on what politicization, or how it can be conceptualized, not only in a theoretical sense, but when it comes to empirically studying politicization. So first of all, I think it's important that politicization is what has been termed a multi-level concept. That means there is a theoretical and normative level of politicization. So as political theorists, we would be discussing politicization. Our friend and colleague and mentor Kari Palonen would be discussing politicization on a theoretical level. And this notion whether politicization is beneficial or whether it's detrimental for democracy or for the European Union, this is very much on the normative level of judgment. So we are not at any kind of empirical study on this level. Then there is what can be termed the meso level. So I borrowed these expressions from the literature. There is what can be termed the meso level, and that would be institutions, that would be the state, that would be the interim level. And then there is obviously the micro level. So it's what citizens think, what citizens do. So in our project, in the DebatEU project, we are very much referring to the micro level. Obviously, this is what we study, but we want to see how the micro level refers to the meso level of the EU's institutions. And we also get back to the theoretical and normative level, because we do conceptual reflections and we do normative judgments. And it's just important, and that would be my take, that I would claim that these levels should not be confused. So the question whether politicization is beneficial or detrimental for European integration is not one that belongs on the empirical level, and it's not one that directly follows from it, but it's one that belongs on the theoretical and normative level, and it should be separated. And I would say that in much of the literature, this separation is not clear enough, probably. So then there is someone named Elmar Schatzschneider who is behind most of the influential politicization definitions in the EU studies literature. And Schatzschneider says there is politics. Politics is marked by conflict. Political conflicts are marked by intensity, visibility, direction, and scope. So he says there is political conflict everywhere. And then Schatzschneider uses this notion of the political system. So the political system, as it has been, for instance, employed by David Easton, is this kind of thing of a black box. So you have the institutions, sometimes you have the political parties that are part of it, and the political system is where sort of the important things take place. And that is a marker, I would claim, of most, not where the majority probably of politicization concepts in the mainstream EU literature. Politicization is a conflict that is visible in the political system. Often the mass media, the quality press, they are counted into the political system, but usually it doesn't go beyond that. So my suggestion is to build on the definition by Kari Pallon. Kari Pallon has a beautiful article, and he showed me he has a new article on conceptualizing politics. He makes a fourfold distinction. He speaks about politics, polity, politicization, and politicking. And politicization is the act to mark an issue as political. So I love this definition. I mean, I really love it because it's so broad. So the problem is that it's very difficult to be operationalizing it. But politicization is actually any act that marks an issue as political. So my favorite example is this saying of the second feminist movement, the private is political, or the person is political. This is marking an area as political that previously had not been seen as political. And Kari then argues that not only any issue can become a political issue, but that this marking of an issue as political marks this issue as playable. So what is very important is that another concept of politics is behind that. So politics is an activity. Politics is not a field or a sphere. So in that model, politics is something that you do, and it's not something that is a system. I'm fully aware that it's probably easier just to say politics is what takes place in the political system, or politics is the political system, or going into politics, because it's much more easy to demarcate it clearly. And when you say politics is an activity and everything can be politics, then obviously you get definition problems. But I think there are a number of advantages to this approach. So the question obviously is then, when do issues become political? So what is the degree, what is the threshold? Who politicizes the issues? And these questions are decisive for the operationalization, but my main argument is that I think it's decisive to look at politicization that not necessarily takes place in the political system, but also outside. One main example would be Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg just, one day decided not to go to school and sat in front of the Swedish Riksdag with a panel, and that was the origins of the Fridays for Future movement. Yeah. So there are a lot of contingencies at play, but no one would have said that was politicization except Kari. As according to this definition, what Greta Thunberg did was an act of politicization, and it just had tremendous consequences that in the end made it into the political system. So this is why I'm saying it's important to look at what takes at politics and politicization as activities and actions. So very briefly, because Cécille will speak about it, in that depoliticization is the counter concept. So if politicization is creating controversialness, naming things as political, depoliticization is taking away or hiding controversialness, excluding possible actors and denouncing the fact that something is political. Margaret Thatcher, with her "there is no alternative," would be an example here. So the European Union uses that. In the Greek austerity debate, this was what my German colleagues were responding to me when I said there's a problem with democracy. They said, yeah, but there was no alternative, as if this justifies that. Yeah. So saying there is no alternative means there's not even the need to be debating. It's just that the facts are like that. Now, this is a short take on European integration theory and how politicization is seen in European integration theory. And there is a very, it's not even influential, it's a classic, Lindberg and Scheingold. They coined this expression of permissive consensus. So the idea, the leading idea in European integration theory for a long time was that European integration was not politicized, so it was not an object of political debate, and that citizens supported it in what Lindberg and Scheingold termed permissive consensus. So we don't really care about what we are not against. So we have a permissive consensus in a way. And it's very interesting that Philipp Schmitter, very early, argued, that's a neo-functionalist classic author, that European integration, if it would become more controversial, could actually be beneficial for the European Union, because he, and that's a quote, more controversialness would lead to a widening of the audience, to more debate, to a redefinition of mutual objectives, to a shift in actor expectancies and loyalty towards the EU. So very early in integration theorizing, and that was in the 1960s, there was this idea that more politicization could actually be good and beneficial for the EU. This is not what most classical or now established accounts in EU integration studies argue. So they would see politics as a sphere or field. They would say that shrinking EU support leads to politicization. They would look at how parties react to voters' changing preferences. They would focus on top-down perspectives. They would look at how media write about the EU, and they would look at how or whether institutions are politicized when they act. So it's like clearly a top-down perspective on politicization, where parties and politicians and allies are the leading actors. Now, what is interesting, this is a kind of thing that I'm developing, so it's not finished, so please give me comments, but I tried to, put this into a kind of model, because I think there are different ways of conceptualizing politicization. This is a model of conceptualization, yeah? How we could see possible interrelations of an increase of actor involvement, so increasing politicization, and EU support. And I would argue that sort of the Schmitter model that I just described, so a widening of the audience, increased debate, etc., would be among those optimist models. I would suggest a differentiation even between a dynamic and a top-down model. So the top-down model would be when parties politicize European integration. So you have, I don't know, Pulse of Europe or Volt, and they make a campaign and they get a lot of votes. That would be rather top-down because it's parties mobilizing voters. Whereas if you have, I don't know, Fridays for Futures or an NGO or a pro-EU NGO that makes a kind of, I don't know, citizen movement or whatsoever, that would be rather dynamic because there is a top-down component in it. So just meaning that there could be ways of politicization that actually increase EU support. And then there is sort of what is, I would term still the dominant view in EU studies, it's the pessimist models. And what is, I think, most dominant is what I term the pessimist top-down model. So in previous presentations, I have earned a lot of criticism for that, because it's mainly directed against Lisbeth Hoge's and Gary Marx's notion of post-functionalism. And people would always beat me. They are not negative, they are not pessimist. No, they are not, I mean, they are doing like really, obviously, a very super well empirically founded analysis of parts of processes of EU party political, EU politicization. This is absolutely correct. They are looking at shrinking EU support and how this leads to an increase of votes for right-wing extremist parties. And that is indeed something that we see happening. I termed it in this model the pessimist dynamic because sort of when you prognose this into the future, then obviously European integration is more or less doomed. Yeah. If more politicization just leads to an increase in votes for right-wing populist parties, then the future looks bleak. I think that this focus on the rather sort of critical dynamics is also due in part to the fact that the model is so much top-down oriented. So because you only take a slice of what is possible. And then let me for a moment say what I mean with a pessimist dynamic model. Interestingly, this is something that is not discussed so much in the literature, but I think it's something that you see when you look at EU referenda. So to me, the Brexit referendum debate would be really a case of the pessimist dynamic model. So a lot of bottom-up movement and protest against the European Union, like really in favor of leaving the European Union. So it's a kind of campaign that was like really critical for EU support. Okay, I think I already used up my time. So in an article that I would be happy to send you if you want, I tried to found these reflections looking at the results of the 2019 EP elections. And just to be short, I would say that there were really different dynamics of politicization at work in the 2019 EP elections. So we saw right-wing populists mobilization being successful, but we also saw mobilization of EU support or a kind of positive or constructive politicization being at work. So my plea is just, and as I said, this is not finished. And even the table that I showed, it's like a drafty table, and I've been working on the expressions meanwhile, and I have other ideas on how to possibly express it or not. So this is a work in progress. But I think EU politicization should be really studied with a focus on different complex dynamics. It's not enough to just limit the study on party politics and salience and institutions. There's more to it. There's a complex picture. And I think there's a lot of empirical proof that we are rather discussing conflicting and partially contradicting dynamics and you know, a picture that goes into different directions than just a one-directional model. So we should not only be concentrating on party politics and votes as main explanatory dimensions, but we should include a focus on different social strata, dynamics, and waves of politicization, issue-specific mobilization, in particular, the dynamics of politicization in the sense of the actions that mark issues as political. Yeah, and I think that's it. And that's an overview of the related applications. And with this, I give over to Cécille. Want to come up front? No, it's okay. Can I change the slide? This is okay. If I want to go back, okay. I'm trying to be. Okay. Okay. Last meeting, Claudia asked me to present my work on depoliticization, which I study as a characteristic of the EU, but also more generally with other colleagues, and as a way of conducting public action. So we have already used the term of depoliticization several times to talk about the EU and the citizens' relationship with it. Here the idea is to see whether it might be useful to use this concept to shed light on what we observe in the focus group. Obviously, Claudia shows that it is useful, but maybe I will show it in another way and discussion about that after. So to make a long story short and hoping to be clear, I'm going to start by definition very quickly. I will probably have to skip some content about how and why depoliticize, and maybe to have more time on the fourth part, what effect does depoliticization have on citizens' relationship with the EU. Is the first three part are extract from book and articles. The fourth one is really to share with you some very preliminary comments
and ideas following the reading of the focus groups. So it's really preliminary and to discuss. So to go with the definition issues, and to say that, as it is often the case in the social sciences, the first difficulty raised by the notion of depoliticization, and Claudia showed also that, is that its success goes hand in hand with a high degree of polysemy, and sometimes loose, not always precise uses of the concept. So it also goes hand in hand with the success of the term in the activist and media worlds, and which it's more and more complicated to use it. So when we are here talk about depoliticization, we don't always know what we are talking about, and in particular, who is being depoliticized. So in particular, there is a lot of work about depoliticization as a characteristics of citizens. The term can cover different types of behavior, but they often share a common normative dimension. This depoliticized behavior is deemed bad, detrimental to democracy. This kind of approach based on the depoliticization of citizens has been strongly criticized by political sociologists in France, in USA, but on two dimensions. On the one hand, they are not always backed by empirical data, and many studies postulate rather than measure the depoliticization of citizens in broader theoretical reasoning on the crisis of democracy. They make it either a cause with democracy going badly because citizens are not sufficiently involved in it, or a consequence with citizens disinvesting because democracy is dysfunctional, but they no longer really have a place in it. And the citizens that no longer have a place in it. Both perspectives are undoubtedly interesting, but they deserve to be observed more closely with much more precaution. On the other hand, work in political sociology points out that reading politics in terms of citizen depoliticization tends to be based on overly restrictive and normative definitions of what constitutes good political behavior. So we did have a discussion yesterday, and probably with Virginie also. It would be very interesting to discuss about it. It can lead too quickly to the conclusion that citizens have lost interest in politics. However, what we take to be disinterest, for example, may be linked more to a feeling of incompetence. So I refer to the book of my colleague Marine de la Salle, Daniela Gaxi, about the representation of ordinary citizens concerning Europe. So the feeling that we are not competent and to answer the question asked, particularly in the opinion polls, which may not make sense to them, or to express a political preference at the ballot box. What we take to be disinterest may also conceal alternative forms of politicization. These citizens may show their interest in politics in other way, via low-profile form of protest, the choice of certain lifestyle, for example, but even the decision not to take part in the usual political consultation, which may be a political choice. So I won't elaborate further for the moment, but it might be interesting to bear these elements in mind when analyzing our focus and maybe our students. This brings me to the way in which I and my colleague users try to use the concept of depoliticization, not in fact to describe the attitude and behavior of citizens, because we are not the specialist of those objects, but those of decision makers, to describe ways of doing and saying public action. Precisely, depoliticization characterizes certain way of doing and saying public action, which have in common the circumvention of democratic debate on public policy. It's very close to what Claudia said before. Indeed, while political decisions always involve arbitration between different values and interests, depoliticization occurs when these choices are concealed, removed from the debate in various ways. consequently, there is no public adversarial debate between existing options, at the end of which elected representative makes that choice explicit. I now go to my second part, and as I say, I will skip the whole part of it, but if you want, we will go back to it during the discussion after. So in a book I edited, we try to answer to 3 questions in particular, together with colleagues working on policies in different national and institutional contexts. In a nutshell, how, why, and with what consequences. So the first major questions was what characteristic forms does depoliticization take? How can we recognize it when it happens? And we show that depoliticization enterprises have in common that they amount to doing politics without appearing to do so, to making societal choices without taking responsibility for them as such. So we show that this can be achieved through rhetorical strategies such as neutralization of choices, the individualization of issues. We talked about that yesterday. We also show that the short-circuiting of democratic deliberation does not only operate, of course, through discourses, but also through institutional arrangement. Second major questions, the users of the politicization, in what context and which actors make particular use of it. So I have to be more quick. So to avoid putting a public issue on the agenda, to avoid the democratic process, because public and adversarial debates are perceived as dangerous, and I will come back to that because it is very common in the representation of political and administrative actors of the EU, and to avoid having to resort to democratic legitimacy, doing politics without looking like it, as for example, agency, commission, etc. And I will come back to the effect on citizens in relation to the EU. So I just want to present a few comments on the EU as a privileged object of depoliticization, because it's obviously our common object in this project. And I also try to show why, as the English political scientist Peter Mayer puts it, the EU can be seen as one of the political spaces where the logic of depoliticization are omnipresent. On this point, I refer you to the work of Nilo, Claudia, and to the book she has edited on the subject. I won't develop too much on how this depoliticization manifests itself at the EU level. I put some themes on the slide, but I think we don't have time enough to develop. Maybe 2 words about the origin of EU depoliticization. So to say that the reason of the success of depoliticization is in Brussels could be linked to that this strategy are linked to a particular relationship with politics, which is a shared distrust among administrative political actors, but also interest groups and even observers, and for example, academics. So a shared distrust of representative democracy and its mechanism. This shared distrust of democracy, of representative democracy, translates, for example, into greater distrust of elected representatives, perceived, for example, by the European civil servants sometimes as short-term clientelists driven by national interest, and a greater distrust of democratic debate, seen as highly imperfect means of determining public policy choices. So I won't go into the origin, some ancient, some more recent, of this representation here, but I would just like to elaborate on the danger associated with putting European issues for debate and politicizing them, as it seems to me linked to the following part of our discussion on focus groups. Indeed, even in academic literature, as Claudia reminded sooner, for example, the work of Stefano Bartolini, for example, Hughes and Marx, and the article on the transition for permissive consensus to constraining dissensus, the politicization of European issues is perceived as having negative effects on citizens for two reasons in particular. Firstly, because it will lead them to exaggerate the EU's capacity for action and room for maneuver, to ultimately have disproportionate expectations towards the EU, even though in this European system, no institution or actor is in a position to hold the same power as a national government. And secondly, because this would introduce this politicization of EU and reinforce a reading of Europe in terms of winners and losers. So I refer to the Euroclash, the book of Neil Flickstein, but of course a lot of other works, which would ultimately be very dangerous for the legitimacy of the EU in the eyes of its citizens. Even though it legitimizes itself as a place of compromise, and my colleague Andy Smith puts it, by maintaining the illusion that Europe is made up of nation states that are globally intact. So this leads me directly to part 4 and the last part. How depoliticization could help to understand what we have observed in the focus groups. So many discourses, including academic ones, tend to hold European citizens responsible for the EU democratic crisis. Their supposed disaffection towards the EU, reflected in abstention or protest vote, would have led the EU to privilege technocratic modes of government. Can we say that citizens' disaffection towards the EU is responsible for its democratic crisis? I think that studies of depoliticization on the one hand, but also our focus groups on the others, seems to contradict this hypothesis. Indeed, in our focus groups, there was little talk, as we said yesterday, of disaffection, disinterest, or even criticism of the EU's very existence. When we do hear criticism, it's often related to high expectation of the EU and the perception of a gap, a discrepancy between what it should be doing and what it can do. On the other hand, we can hypothesize that the depoliticization of the EU is not, of course, without consequences for citizens' representation, including those we capture in the focus groups. So, first of all, we could observe that depoliticization has these significant effects on the image that citizens have of the EU, and in particular, on the difficulties they encounter in appropriating this political object. We can think of 3 related phenomena usually linked to depoliticization and which are also evoked or voiced in the focus groups. So the difficulty of understanding its decision-making processes, the low visibility of political representation, apart from the confrontation of national interests between member states, the systematic recourse to the technical justification of political choices, to the detriment of a more voluntarist discourse based on values and on the choice between values. And yet in the interview, at least with the French and Finns, these themes of the EU as difficult to understand were clearly present. And it's also interesting that they mention a lot of time education as a solution. And it's just as indicative of a certain representation of the EU as a technical object, as to think that interest in it will come through a scholar approach. Many of our students also say that they don't really understand the political stakes involved in negotiation in Brussels. Second effect of depoliticization may be to delegitimize the conflict, leaving little room for the defense and confrontation of political alternatives. Not alternatives to the EU, but different projects for the EU. In other words, it could be said that it contributes to equating any discussion of the EU's very functioning with the hostile reading of the European project itself. This delegitimized position critical of the EU government, and this is what we sometimes find in focus group. So the difficulty, the feeling that it's difficult of holding a critical discourse as if the EU were somehow too fragile to be hit. It could also be said that its rejection of conflict has resulted in the field of critical confrontation and open conflict being left to the Eurosceptic alone, who have made good use of it over the past decade. For finish, a third effect of depoliticization identified in academic work on the pathology of representative democracy is that it could encourage a loss of confidence in representative democracy. With elected representatives giving up their role as representatives, voters would feel that their votes no longer count, and this situation will more generally fuel fatalism and discouragement, encourage voters' apathy. Here, the effect of depoliticization are compounded by the fact that we don't have, with the Commission, a real government in a general sense, and at least one institution, the Council of the EU, whose composition and political orientation are not linked to the European election. All these factors make it all the more improbable or unlikely to see the translation results of European citizens in public policy and political choices. So elements of these types are also to be found in our focus group. In the first French focus group, for example, participants said they felt that their EP vote didn't count, and generally that there was little room for maneuver for the citizens, even via the new instruments of participatory democracy. So to conclude with two remarks to put into perspective. While depoliticization may have its effect, it is only one of the explanatory variables for what we observe in the focus group. The comparative perspective, for example, also highlight national effect, nature of their relationship with the EU, small countries versus large country, geographical proximity to the conflict in Ukraine, length of time of membership, but also the role of education and the media in the treatment of the EU, were very different between different member states. The role of national political context also in the periods in which the focus group are carried out. So secondly, the work of political sociology on relations with the EU also encourages us to pay closer attention to the way in which these relations are constructed and expressed through ordinary experiences. On this point, there's a lot to be said for the focus groups. So our experiences such as flying back to Europe, using the common currency, taking part in the Erasmus program, can also build a sense of belonging to Europe. And it will be interesting for us to try and explore how we link a sense of belonging to the EU and a relationship with the EU as a political object. So many thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I have to say that trying to wrapping up everything in 15 minutes will be difficult, but however, there was very good introduction by Claudia and also just by Cécile now. So I think that some of the slide I will be able to skip it, and I will be also happy to send it to you. So the first thing that I wanted to tell you is about the experience that I had with this kind of methods that are focus group and also to the depoliticization and politicization of European citizens. So it's a long way back. So this project was directed by Sophie Duchesne, and we did some focus group in Oxford, Paris, and Louvain in 2005, 2006. And I will present some of the data today in order to show you. I did also my PhD using this data, and I did a PhD that was at the crossroad of Crans and Qual, because we have been discussing Eurobarometer's data, but I was, and I still believe that in order to discuss with those who use Crans, you have also to look at the data and to see if you can see something else. And in fact, I was able in this book to demonstrate that if you look at the data, you can also see a kind of depoliticization of citizens. You don't only see this kind of Euroscepticism, there are something else going on there. Then I mentioned this yesterday, and I thank Cécille for bringing this thing up in the conclusion. I had PhD students of mine that did some focus group with young people in Brussels. And I think that it could be really of interest to you, because those are really the same kind of person that you interviewees, at least in the neighborhood, they were the richer. And so we had a piece on belonging. So I think that it's really linked to what you said. And then finally, in the research network, Jean Monnet Research Network, so very close to what you are doing, all of you today. We did some focus group also in different countries, and we have a piece in English in the review Politique Européenne, which is presenting what we did. And if this is something that could be of interest to you, this is a bilingual review, and you could also publish what we call chantier de recherche, so research fieldwork, where you just say how you did your fieldwork and you present the data before analyzing it. And I think that it's also important to have this kind of piece when publishing afterwards. It's easy then to refer to the methodological piece and say, if you want more information, everything is there. And they recently published with another doctoral student of mine, an article in GCMS that I think could be of interest to you. It's really about the narrative of Europe. So how citizens really look at the values that are vehiculated by the EU, and how they don't just reception them, but how they reframe those values and how they try to make sense of them. So out of those, I did had an ERC grant, and I will come back to this later. But what I wanted to do first in the first minutes is to go back to the book, because when listening to you yesterday and also this morning, it rings a bell. It like really, it was published in 2014. My PhD was finished in 2010. So it's quite old, we could say, but you will see that in the codes that I will present, we can see a kind of really similarities. So the idea was to ask, are really citizens becoming more Eurosceptic than they used to be? In the idea of Huggy and Marx, like we have more politicized public and we will have a split, the winners and losers, Liechtenstein, we have seen all this. And I wanted to assess those who were in the middle of the road. I told you that I wanted to look at Eurobarometer's data set. And if you look in the question, you do have a question that it's, do you think that the euro is a good thing, or European Union is a good thing, a bad thing, or neither good nor bad? And in fact, over time, you see that those who choose the middle category is growing, which in a way contradicts the theory of, you know, the polarization of the EU. So I wanted to understand who these citizens were and how they thought about the EU. So I used focus group, as you did, as a microscope. So we did 24 focus group in the cities, as I mentioned, using different kind of social and national comparison. And we wanted to have this focus group as a test of politicization, as Sophie Duchesne and Florence Gueule have been using it. So we had 4 questions. Again, I will be quick, but what I did for my PhD is, I guess, something that you arrived to also, it's coding the data. And I code all the data of these 24 focus group when they were discussing Europe. So I decided when they were discussing Europe. So it was not like looking for a Euro world or something like that. I was really like selecting the data that I will analyze. And the first result that I arrived to, and I'm sure that it will not be a surprise to you, is that if you look at the percentage of discussion, we invited them to discuss Europe. We asked them questions about Europe. We paid them to speak about Europe. We were in front of them, reminding them that they had to speak about Europe. And in fact, they speak about Europe only 22%. And you can believe me when I say that I coded everything that I could on Europe in order to have data. So that was one of the results. It was difficult, and it was not so much what they wanted to discuss. They discussed a lot, but not about the EU as such. And Europe was from the EU. So you can also see differences in terms of social background that you could expect. Activists were more inclined of discussing Europe than working class people, but also national differences. So you see that the Belgium were the most inclined of discussing the US one could expect, the French a little bit less, and Oxford more, and I could explain that if you're interested, but that's something that was striking. And the first result for me was that if I look back to those who have been selecting in our questionnaire, the neither nor category, so those who said it's neither good nor bad, then you see that the differences are not so big. So it couldn't be really that explanation that they were not able or not willing to discuss the EU. There was something else behind they choosing this middle category. And I came up with an analysis of this group, and I distinguished between three ideal types of reaction that they had. This could be one reaction shared by one participant, or it could be that one participant had more than one typology. So it's ambivalence, distance, and fatalism. And they are closely related to each other, and I will show you some quotes. And this is where I hope that it will ring a bell to you as well. So first, the ambivalence. We discussed this, that in fact, Cécille said yesterday and just now, you know, there is a discrepancy between ideal and practice. And this is really the ambivalence. Like, you know, I think it's good, but in fact, in practice, it doesn't work. And here you have a quote without any interruption. So it's the same participant. He say, I think that they are taking profits, the big company. Then Anthony say, absolutely. So there is no disagreement. And he say, but we profit as well. So in the very same moment, without any discussion, he is, you know, in between two things. So the first kind of ambivalence is between the past, the present, and the future, in the sense that I thought that it was a good thing, but today I'm not sure anymore. Or today it's very bad, but in the future it will be better for our children. This is a kind of ambivalence that was part of the data. Then the second is really what I think you already discussed, this ideal between this discrepancy between ideal and practice. So really, you know, it's a noble idea, there are some values, but when I really live in those policies, I don't believe that it's working. And again, the hypothesis is that the growing importance of the EU, so what Claudia referred as the macro politicization, can go hand in hand with this kind of ambivalence. It's because you see more and more Europe that it's becoming more balanced. Because beforehand, you thought that it was good and you had no practice. But the more you have practice, the more you think that there is a discrepancy. So here you have a focus group from Paris workers realized in 2005. And you see that Jean-Marie say, okay, it's being part of the European Union. It's really great in theory. And then he continues, and at the end he say, but it's all theory. And they all laugh. Like they all agree that in theory it works. Then there is also a kind of indifference that could be linked to depoliticization. And I think that we have discussed distance and also today with the Cécille presentation, fatalism. And in fact, those are two different kinds of positioning that, again, are also linked to each other. So if we go to distance, I guess that's the more obvious for you. It's really the fact that it's complex, it's difficult, it's far away, it's all the things that you have been presenting so far, with a version of it, which is exteriority in the British case. So the distance in the British case is really, we are outside of it. We cannot identify, it's not part, or we are, for different reasons, outside. Then the distance by fatalism is that they really express the fact that whatever they say, whatever they do, it will continue, it will happen. European integration will continue. So why should they really think that they can do anything about it? So we come back to what Claudia mentioned yesterday about the agency, the TINA argument, there is no alternative. And here you have, you know, quotes also from Jonathan White and a quote of one of our focus group, but I could have, you know, have many of them. Actually, they're deliberately not telling us quite what's going on. I think that in about 20 years, we'll all feel Europeans. So there was this idea that, you know, they will do it. And there was a part of referenda, they do referenda and then still they continue. So I think that it's really close to what you have been saying. So I know that I'm fast, but I will be happy to send you the slide, the book, everything. I'm more than happy to share. So this is really to say that these reactions, at least when I wrote the book, were not part of how we understood citizens' reaction to the EU. It was not part of the theoretical framework. And out of what I hear to you, it's still not in the picture. So I think that there is still work to be done there. But out of all this, because when I received the invitation, it was, about the citizens and our elite reactions. So we have inside my ERC project a paper now, and again, I'm apologizing to be short and quick. But what we try to do in this paper is to look how citizens don't look at the EU as a whole, but at political actor responsiveness and responsibility, to try to move a little bit from this general picture that we seems to agree on how it looks like. And we begin by, again, thanks to Cécille, by Peter Mayer puzzle that you probably know of, that there is a dilemma between responsiveness and responsibility. And we want to know if citizens do perceive, this dilemma, or if they understand responsiveness in the same way, responsibility in the same way. So I see that some of you are nodding, so I'm quick here. So what we do, and this is important, we build on what we have been calling since the book Overlooking Europe, the qualitative turn of EU studies, and I think that this project is clearly part of it. So it begins with Céline Belot and Diaz Medrano in the 20s, so end of the 90s, and it's still going now. And what we do is a constitutive analysis. So we want to understand how citizens understand those concepts and not, putting anything on it. So we do two things, and I think it's important. We do a cognitive frames, like normal, like how they understand the concept, or at least how they frame the issue. But then we are also interested in norms. And there we want to see if they agree about the frame that they use, or if they disagree. So when discussing responsiveness, do they use the same frame? And if so, do they agree about the frame that they use? Of course, I'm saying that it's not as clear in the discussion. You have been doing focus groups, so it's not like, I agree with your conceptualization. Yeah, I do agree with you. It's not that at all, but this is how we have been doing the analysis. And the data that we use, it's really coming from this qualitative turn. So here you have the PhD thesis of Céline Belot until 2019, the RESTEP project that I could have now, the Debating Europe project in this slide. And we were lucky enough to have access to 4 data sets. So colleagues that we close by give us access to the data. So we went back to the interviews of Céline Belot in the 90s until the focus group that we helped to make in 2020. So we have a kind of range of data that we could reanalyze. Reanalyze means that for some data, we were not there to produce. For some others, for the 3 last data sets, I was there partly. But for some of my colleagues, they were not there. So it's a methodological challenge. Can we reanalyze qualitative data that have been produced by others? And in this ID, we have also some comparison, national comparison that we could use. So we did a qualitative secondary analysis, and I will not go too far in the results. I will be happy, but I think that for your project, as you are really at the stage of analyzing, finalizing the analyzing and publishing, this is probably an important part. What we did was what we call secondary qualitative analysis. So we select these corpus because they had the same topic, and there is variation. And this is what I was referring to yesterday. Today, I really believe that the only way to do secondary analysis is in order to do theory building and to look for commonalities. And I think that in a way, the kind of collaborative project that you are in, it's also the only way that you will be able to convince colleagues when publishing. Otherwise, they will say to you, what are true focus group in Croatia? What is the, but if the idea is to find commonalities and try to make the exercise of theory building of politicization, depoliticization, in our case, responsiveness, responsibility, then you don't have the same kind of backlash because you are not trying to say something about the case specifically. You want to use the case to build your theory. So this is what we did in this exercise. And in order to do so, we developed a method that it's called abductive coding. And we have been publishing this article in an American journal, which is Sociological Method and Research. And I'm not keen on impact factor. I'm not keen on figures, but I just want to tell you the figures because I think that it will be important in the upcoming years. We published this. This is a 6.5 impact factor journal, so it's huge. And we published that in February 2022, and we had already more than 11,000 views. We have already 40 stations in 1 year. So it's, you know, I would never expect this, and you know, I'm proud because it's one of the output of the project. But what I'm trying to say is that what you do as a collective behavior is something that it's done more and more, and people are looking of way of making sense of what we do. How do we do national comparison when you were not there in France, but still you will, you know, co-analyze the data? So how do we do that? And I think that it's more and more the case that we change our way to do qualitative theory building, and their grounding theory is probably not the solution, and not because it's not good, but because, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at you, but okay, it's fine then. Because you were not there in France, how can you really, you know, make all the point that you do interpretative analysis in this project? You can do interpretative analysis of a case, but then collectively, you don't do interpretative analysis. You exchange on your interpretative analysis, you build together something which could be an objective code. So I think that we have to think about our practice as qualitative researcher. And also, this is why I think that there was this kind of buzz around this article, because out there, you know, either you do deduction, induction, but this is not what you can do with this kind of comparative research design and this kind of data. And I will just go to the conclusion because I know that we don't have time, but again, I will be happy to send the paper when it's published, because it's revised and resubmit now in a special issue. So we arrive by looking at responsiveness and responsibility to rethink how responsibility and responsiveness are framed by citizens. And we really, and it echoes what we have discussed yesterday, so this is why I wanted also to present you this, the frame that they use when they discuss responsiveness and responsibility, it's about choice and agency. This is how they frame it. It's not about electoral competition. It's not about conflict. It's about who has a choice, who has the agency to do something. On responsiveness, they do agree that there should be responsiveness for political actors at the EU level. They should be responsive to citizens. They all agree. They don't discuss this. And they all agree also that it is not the case. There is no discussion about this. When it comes to responsibility, so that the fact that EU actors are constrained by international institutions, that also they have to take into account long-term, you know, issues and this kind of thing, then there is discussion about the norm. They disagree that this should be the objective. So for example, the 3% of the GDP, they can discuss about the fact that, no, why should we be responsible? This is not what politics is about. There they have a discussion about what is responsibility. But what is behind responsiveness and responsibility discussion is always agency and choice of political actors. This is how they understand the political world, at least when it comes to the socioeconomic governance. So this is why we say that really their understanding is depoliticize when it comes to responsiveness, because there is a kind of collective agreement that we agree on the norm and we agree on the fact that they don't do it. But when it comes to responsibility, there you are still debate in how the EU should position itself. So thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry that I was quick. I tried to cover many things, so I will be happy to have discussion about this and to send you whatever you want. Thank you.
So Vivian, could you monitor the chat? So people from the online audience, if you want to ask a question, can you please put it in the chat? There is, I think, one thing in the chat. Okay, it's just yes. Okay. Okay, so thanks a lot. Comments, questions? I have one. Okay, so Ruja, you want to go first? Okay. So many things, and I really regret that because Virginie has to leave at 12. So we definitely have to continue this, and I see a lot of exciting discussions coming up because it's really, really, really close to, I think, what we have been doing here. I think we are a little bit more theoretical, conceptual, and interpretative, and you are a little more into like the empirical depth, but I think this is very much on the same track. So this is, no, but okay, let me say you have done probably more solid and more deep down empirical work than we have been doing it, I think, from what I see. But the question that I would have is, we had a slight discussion about that before we started to discuss about the coding. So we had this, it's not a problem. We decided it's not a problem, but we wanted to build a code book. We built a code book and we coded. And my hunch in the moment is that we probably should also be with this preliminary code book coding the last focus groups. But we discovered that there is no like pure intercoder reliability. So we decided to drop. So probably in the publications that we do, we will describe exactly that we used coding as an interpretative tool, but that it's not like a coding in an exact sense. I don't think this is problematic. Coding always has been an interpretative tool. This is an interpretative approach. We do a comparison, and I think it's very, very well grounded. So in fact, we could write a kind of research diary of what we have been doing. And I really was interested in your experiences with this, because also I think, I mean, I had the impression from having read at least part of the literature that you presented, that you have been more strict in this coding. And I mean, I know that Sophie Duchesne is even more strict in that kind of things. So in relation also to this new article that you mentioned, how do you see this, knowing that we are addressing a public that is, how can I say that, very orthodox. Yeah. So if you tell to people that you did focus groups, but you did not obtain intercoder reliability. So we had a training with a guy from Max QDA, and he said, okay, then you are doomed. Then he was sort of a limit to saying then your findings are not worth anything, because the journals want you to say what was your intercoder reliability. So and from my experiences with some journals, I know it can be a problem. So I would really be interested in hearing your reflections about that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, because it offers me the opportunity to go back to exactly what we did. And what we did was a collective endeavor of coding, but it was really qualitative, and it was not at all, I don't know, strict, as you mentioned. And so this is how we came with this article about abductive coding, because, and I think that the reaction that you will get will be, and I will come back to the cross-coding question, but will be both from people who expect you to have cross-coder reliability index, but also from colleagues that are sociologists who do their own fieldwork themselves. They will react badly to your data. They will say to you, I don't believe that you can say what you say, that you are doing interpretative analysis. So the backlash for us was coming from both sides. This is why this is why we came with this adjective, by saying, okay, we agree with both of you, but what we do is not, it's not about intercoder reliability. We don't care about this, because we are not saying that in the 90s people, 50% of the population were thinking like this. So we don't really care in the intercoder reliability, because we use coding as a way to build theory again. So coding was just a way to arrive with categories and to build the way that we understand what citizens think about you. And for the other, the interpretative, we say also, we agree with you, we need to be into the data to have an interpretative thing. So our second part of the code is really interpretative, but we cannot begin by interpretation as you think that we can do. We cannot emerge in the data, the 24 focus group, as if it was possible to have this kind of knowledge and this kind of global interpretation. So we try to find this answer. Then for the intercoder reliability, when I did my PhD, I was alone, so it was not a question, because Sophie Duchesne really disliked coding. So the publication that she has with coding, it's only with me. She tried, and she told me, you have to do something with Atlas TI. This is how we do qualitative work now. She tried, and she said, I don't like it. I'm old school. I don't do that. So
I had no problem of intercode reliability on the project because I did all the coding by myself. Was it a nightmare, 24 focus group? Yes, it was. But that was not an issue. For the project that we have now, as I mentioned, we have now, I hope that it, on a special issue in, in JEP, so it's one of the best European journal, and we had no comments of interreliability coding at all. But because we make it clear that what we were aiming to was still building, not saying anything linked to empirics and comparison and this kind of thing. We use comparison, we use empirics to think about how we could reframe responsiveness and responsibility. And there I think that you are safe, at least if you don't have this bad reviewer too who said, oh, I want detective coding, I want intercoder reliability. But so I never had any experience of it. So, but on the epistemological side, I think that this is where it comes back, for this kind of comparative project at least.
Well, actually, thank you for this methodological basically relief that you provided, because we were struggling with this, and I was feeling very uncomfortable not being a qualitative scientist and doing this and trying to extrapolate based on very few cases and generalize. But as a theory building exercise, I agree. And actually, yesterday we were discussing that one possible approach to the publication would be to do the case studies as segments in a theory building exercise. And I think this could be a viable approach. I don't know whether we will adopt it at the end of the day, but I see the virtues of this. So thank you for this, and I look forward to reading the piece on responsibility and responsiveness. Really, I have another query, maybe a comment with regard to the presentation of Claudia on politicization. Correct me if I misunderstood, but did you characterize the Brexit campaign as a bottom-up, as an example of a bottom-up pessimist, politicization example? And I would tend to disagree that it was a bottom-up. I think it was a top-down. It was elite-driven, mostly, UK party, and then fractions within the Conservatives, but also within Labour were very instrumental into delivering Brexit. So I don't think there was any genuine mobilization, grassroots mobilization to push Brexit. It was, from what I know and from what I've observed as a layperson, I haven't studied the Brexit process, the impression was that it's actually very much party driven. So, and this observation led me to two questions. One is, do we really have examples of bottom-up politicization? What could be the examples? And even more interestingly, do we have examples of optimist bottom-up politicization that would lead to increase European integration? I can immediately think of such examples, but they come from the periphery, from Ukraine. The Maidan protests were like that, the Orange revolutions, and also some mobilizations in peripheral countries like Bulgaria, which always had this European flag as a symbol of the grievances of the publics and the activists participating in these mobilizations to ask for changes in the way politics is being done in Bulgaria to be more European-like. But these are examples from the periphery. And they do not necessarily deepen the integration Europe-wide. They are like instances of attempts to catch up with the rest rather than deepen integration. So it would be interesting to maybe discuss examples, if any, of this bottom-up politicization, which is optimist. because otherwise we fall into this criticism that actually all forms of politicization are either top-down or they are detrimental for the European project, or both.
Two examples of bottom-up mobilization. It was a case in France during the referendum 2005. It was pessimist one year. Well, I mean, pessimist, but at the left side of the political field. It was not mostly discourse against Europe, but discourse in favor on other Europe, less liberal, etc. And it was a kind of pessimistic mobilization, but a kind of optimistic mobilization too. If we leave the debate between in favor or in opposition, and if we enter on a debate about what kind of Europe we want. So perhaps sometimes the difference between pessimist and optimistic is a normative view of, you know, of what we can observe. Yeah, what we can see as pessimistic can also be seen as optimistic. It was exactly the case in France in 2025, the 2005 referendum. And another kind of optimistic mobilization was the federalist militants were quite important in the 50s, 60s, sometimes 70s. It's quite old, but in the line of Spinelli organizations, etc. He has this idea, Spinelli, we were speaking about him yesterday night in the Spitz evening. And but he tried to build what is called, I don't know the word in English, but in French, l'avant-garde, a popular avant-garde. He was a militant, Marxist militant, and he has the same idea. So he tried to build a bottom-up mobilization in favor of federalism in Europe. And yes, it's still existing. Yeah, no. But they consider themselves as a sort of avant-garde, so they have to, you know, to fight for federalism. So there is different kinds of this type of mobilization, and we have some students who are part of those movements, federalism. Yeah, so.
Right. Well, thanks very much for these presentations. I was thinking of one thing. They didn't talk too much about this work on about social class, because when you talk about politicization, usually you refer to people who are sort of, you may use the term of agency, like Colin Hay, but I mean people who have the knowledge and awareness about certain things, right? So that they have this capacity, you know, to be politicized and to do something, but most people perhaps are not. So I was wondering if you could have, wouldn't you have a situation where you have an issue that is politicized, very politicized for certain people and totally depoliticized for other people at the same time? That, you know, that it's a bit more perhaps complicated, you know, if you look at the big picture than just is something politicized or not. So that was one point. The other point was that I was thinking of politicization, that you could also think of it in terms of something active or passive, that you could think that Spinelli, for instance, was a kind of professional of politicization in the sense that he was a militant, right? So he would politicize certain topics and so on. And that he would engage in sort of the strategies of politicization, right? So actively. But then you could also think that there would be targets of that strategy that would be passive in a way, that he would just instrumentalize in a certain way to further his agenda or whatever. So could this be interesting that you would have like active, passive, you know, dimension also involved in this activity, so it would be a bit more complicated, perhaps. I had some other ideas, but Willy, you want to say something?
Reactive possible. in order to have a more complexity again. For example, Spinelli, he tried to politicize the question, and he was involved on politicization. But at the same time, he is in favor of a depoliticized way to build Europe, because he wants to promote the role of judges and constitutional courts, etc., in order to avoid decision of national parliamenters to engage in a war. So it was sometimes complicated on that way, and that is remarks I have about Cécile's presentation and point of view, because sometimes, I mean, you can decide to, it's a political objective to stop, I mean, competencies of parliamentarians, for example. So it's, well, quite, yes. Yes, exactly. And another thing is that we have two different electoral or legitimacy, legislative and executive one. So sometimes the less competencies for parliaments, parliamentarians, etc., can be more competencies for executive persons like president who can be elected. So I mean, deparliamentarization is not always a depoliticization, and so it's probably more complicated. Yeah.
Just perhaps a reaction about what you say, Nilo, about the social gap. One chapter in the book Overlooking is on this, and we already mentioned nil fiction and all that. So I think that we cannot think about those issues without also thinking about, education, competencies, knowledge, and all this. And I think that one way of thinking of this question of politicization in that way, and we discussed that a little bit also yesterday evening, and this is what we try to do in the ERC Calidem, it's to say that if we seem to find that citizens do rely on some knowledge that they have, which is practices, so Erasmus or administrative burden or these kind of things, that it means that we need to look more about how they discuss policies and not politics. And there you go to this kind of complexity, because it's not the same policy that matters to different kind of citizens, because they don't live in the same politics, in fact, because of this. And I think that it's another way of rethinking politicization that we push with Claire Dupuy. And it's linked to Colin Hay and Flinders' way of thinking politicization more than Zurn and this kind of thinker. Is really to say that agency choice matter, but then it means also that how we think about what politics means should be reframed. And really how citizens discuss politics, it's about policies. It's not about electoral actors, it's not about competition, it's not about all this. What they look at, and when it comes to the EU is the same. You find some interest in social policies or in Erasmus, because those are, students at university, but we had very complex discussion with, for example, people from Molenbeek, which is a very poor neighborhood in Brussels, but they discussion were very complex discussion about social policy and how to get it and how, you should do that and that and how the EU should do this and this. And it was not like, normal discussion. It was really precise. So the way that we think about competencies is also wrong. We think about the fact that it's difficult to say left, right, or I'm also going too far here, but it's really about what they get. So I think that a way to rethink it's really to look at policies in order to grasp this.
Another comment to you is that you had a hypothesis, in the beginning there about the ideal and the reality and so on. And I wonder, is it also linked with this idea that what Jacques Delors said about the EU was this ovni politique, this unidentified political object and so on. The reason simply of the ambivalence is it doesn't make any sense, to somebody who is on the logic of left and right and government and parliament, this and that, and prime minister. I mean, the EU doesn't make any sense compared to that. And the ambivalence comes from there, simply that it's just an unidentified political object.
But yeah,
I was too quick on the hypothesis, but one of the things that really follow what you say is that one of the distance that comes, it's linked to the fact that the EU is becoming normal politics. Now, those are political actors.
Can I come in at this point? Are you finished or sorry?
No,
I didn't want
not
to
yet,
interrupt.
but
Okay,
only
on.
one sentence. So the hypothesis there is that the more you see the EU becoming political in the sense of political competition, the more those who could identify with some values about, you know, peace, mobility, and this kind of thing, they just say, that's normal politics. This is not the world that I live in. This is not the way I understand. So
yeah, thank you for saying that, because I think that's a key point in what we are after. The EU is becoming normal politics. And I think that's a huge kind of conceptual mistake or wrong alignment in many concepts on both politicization and Euroscepticism. Because they are still in this 1950s, so you are either in favor of the EU or you are against. Many, many Germans still tend to think this. Whereas if the EU is normal politics, well, you can just be against next generation EU because you think it's wrongly made. You can just be against the new pact on migration because you think it's horrible, would be my position. And it doesn't mean I'm against the EU. I'm just not happy with the outcome. Yeah. So I voted for the German government and I am extremely unhappy with their law on new meetings. So that's just my bloody democratic right. This is what democracy is about. And we definitely, we as researchers must not forget that. So that's, I think, the first point. So we didn't talk so much about Euroscepticism, but I think part of the contribution of what we are all doing here and what will be an outcome of this project will be a kind of more differentiated discussion and concept development. And then I wanted to say something on Ruja's questions, because I think it's important for what we have been discussing here too. So I just looked it up. I have been developing the terms because the optimist and pessimist, it's a bit polemic, obviously. Yeah, so I have sort of renamed it the enhancement scenario and the obstacle scenario, because I think it's a little bit less, you know, strongly normative in a way. So the bottom-up enhancement scenario, I think the French referendum debate was very much bottom-up and there were very positive effects. The German pro-Europeans, older German pro-Europeans usually want to kill me when I say that. But the French voted no. Yes, they voted no, but this is what is democracy about. So they had an intensive debate for 6 months and then they voted against the treaty in their majority. So this was exactly what democracy should be. A reflected debate. You had NGOs, you had people from sort of activists popping up. So there was an intense debate. This is exactly what political debates in democracy should be about. Well, we didn't like the outcome, but that can happen. So we should think about what was wrong in the question and in the object at stake. And then I think there is another thing. So I thought about Fridays for Future and the last European elections, because I think Fridays for Future really politicized the issue of climate change. They didn't really politicize the issue of the EU, but they clearly see the EU as an actor against climate change. So I think that there was a huge drive towards votes for Green parties in the last EP elections. This has also been termed the Greta effect. So one thing that is very interesting is that the better educated younger people in the north of the European Union voted for Green parties, whereas the not so well educated, poorer voters in the south of the European Union voted against migration. So I think there is a thing to it, which links to social stratification and center periphery in the European Union. Yeah, because obviously you can see that there are those who can afford to think of climate change and others who cannot afford. And this is all the more ironic as the south of Europe is much more affected by climate change. Yeah? So I think there is a big thing in these issues. So yes, you are right. I mean, they are probably the least indicators for this bottom-up enhancement scenario. But why is that? I mean, European integration used to be a kind of utopia when it began. So the European federalists, they campaigned for it. It was a beautiful, positive vision. I mean, who would campaign for today's Europe? I mean, come on. Not even us Jean Monnet professors would do that because it's so difficult. So there's nothing, I'm sorry to say this, but there are so few things that are beautiful in the European Union today that you would like to stand up for. I maybe have a last example, and that's Pulse of Europe. Pulse of Europe also has a bottom-up component. So we are going to have Marianne Müller from Pulse of Europe. And that developed also in the EU election campaigns as a counter-reaction against right-wing populist criticism. But these people in Pulse of Europe, I mean, they are the ones that benefit from European integration. So it's not like it's a citizen movement, but it's the better educated, wealthier, so the principal pro-Europeans. So I think all I'm saying is that for our analytical focus, we at least need to see those possibilities. So if you cut out of this matrix of 4 possible relations, just the negative ones and just the top-down ones, then you will find what you are asking for. So I think we need to enlarge the perspective. And then whether you find the scenarios or not is related to, whether it's worth fighting for the European Union or politicizing it. We have actually not really more time. We are over time, but we were a bit late, and we have the point that Virginie has to leave at about 12, and we wanted to have a discussion with you as our advisory board member. So my suggestion would be, if there are no more like urgently pressing questions, we have a five-ish minute break, short, toilet, etc. There's one question. And there's coffee outside, and then we discuss, and we sort of, yeah? Everyone agrees? Okay, thanks to the audience, and see you today at 5 for the next session.